A 5-second countdown.
Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon. I call this hearing to order. A quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I ask unanimous consent for our colleague, Representative Ann Custer, to participate in today's hearing, should she be able to attend. We have a number of members participating remotely today, and before we proceed, I would like to go over some of the items for our members participating remotely. First, if you're experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. Members participating remotely must continue to use the video function for the duration of their participation in the hearing unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render the member unable to fully participate on camera. It is the committee and subcommittee policy that members participating remotely will remain muted when not recognized, just like turning your microphone on and off during an in-person hearing. This is out of courtesy to all members on the committee and so that background noise does not interfere with another member who is recognized to speak. When you are recognized, you will need to unmute your microphone and pause for a couple of seconds before speaking so that we'll be able to hear everything that you say. If you wish to be recognized, please raise your hand using the WebEx raise hand function, unmute your microphone, and ask to be recognized. In order to ensure that everything members say is captured on the live stream of this hearing, I ask that members pause for 2 or 3 seconds before beginning to speak. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email that document to veteransaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. It will be uploaded to the committee document repository. Please keep in mind that you will need to refresh the repository page as it does not automatically update. Without objection, members will be recognized in order of committee seniority for questioning witnesses today. This will make it easier for me to ensure that all members participating have an opportunity to be recognized. Does any member have a question about the conduct of this hearing with members participating remotely? Well, hearing none, I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's witnesses include VA officials and experts with important knowledge and perspectives from inside the department, including the Acting Deputy Secretary Pamela Powers. We will also hear from experts at the Government Accountability Office and Disabled American Veterans. Last week, the GAO released a report titled Sexual Harassment, Inconsistent Policies and Information Hinder VA Efforts to Protect Employees. The GAO findings provide insight into whether VA is doing enough to address sexual harassment. As GAO will testify, VA is not doing enough, and the ongoing pervasiveness of sexual harassment hinders patients' ability to get care and employees' ability to do their jobs effectively. This is all deeply troubling. And GAO does report that VA is heading in the right direction, but it is clear that the pace must increase and more work must be done to ensure the safety of all. The department must make addressing sexual harassment a much higher priority. When I read the witness's written testimony, a clear pattern emerged for me. The Department of Veterans Affairs is simply moving too slowly in addressing the shortcomings in its policies and procedures to address sexual harassment. During today's hearing, I will ask why VA will take many months and even years to implement what seems to me straightforward recommendations by GAO. Here's one example. The department has laid out that basic and critical changes involving the managers charged with reporting sexual harassment will not see completion until the year 2024. And this is an issue that VA itself noted as a problem since at least 2 years ago. This panel needs to know why this will take 4 years to implement. Worse, VA has not agreed to adhere to clear federal-wide rules about who must be in charge of overseeing major sexual harassment policies within the department. Currently, the leadership structure creates potential conflicts of interest regarding how VA oversees its sexual harassment process, and this must be fixed. There are other examples. VA still does not require reporting of all sexual harassment complaints, resulting in underreporting and less effective oversight. VA hopes to correct this by the end of 2021. But once again, this is a problem that the department has known about for quite some time. I joined with 8 of my colleagues, including the chairs and ranking members of both the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committees, urging the department to implement all of GAO's recommendations and that VA expedite its current timetable. The issue of sexual harassment at VA is an important priority for me and many on both sides of the aisle. I hope that through our discussion here today, we will see a commitment from VA along with clear actions they plan to take that prove to us that they too are making sexual harassment prevention a top priority. I'd now like to recognize my colleague, Ranking Member General Bergman, to deliver any opening remarks he may have. General Bergman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is entitled Safety for All, Ending Sexual Harassment in the Department of Veterans Affairs. This is our objective, but admittedly, it is a very broad one. Employee harassment and patient harassment could, on their own, support separate hearings. Despite the breadth of this issue, one thing that is true for all forms of sexual harassment is that all the mandatory training in the world will not end it completely. In order to achieve our goal, we need individuals, employees, and veterans alike to treat one another with respect in order to change the VA's culture. And when sexual harassment does happen, despite our best efforts, management must be committed to holding employees and veterans accountable for their actions. Only through accountability can we bring sexual harassment at the VA to an end. When sexual harassment of a VA employee occurs, management is responsible for ensuring that employees have access to programs that are efficient, effective, and fair. However, GAO's recent report on sexual harassment of VA employees identified numerous issues that are ripe for improvement. First is the Harassment Prevention Program, or HPP. HPP was stood up in 2017 with the intention of preventing harassment before it becomes unlawful. This is a laudable objective and one that I fully support. But as GAO's report found, VA has failed to finalize the directives and implementing guidance for the 4-year-old program, preventing it from fulfilling its objectives completely. Additionally, it is my understanding that HPP is only comprised of 9 full-time employees. 9 full-time staff seems to me to be inadequate for a department-wide program supporting 390,000 employees. I hope today to discuss VA's commitment to this program and get assurances from VA that HPP directives and guidance will be finalized this year and that the program will be staffed appropriately to serve VA employees across the country. Next, GAO found that there is an apparent conflict of interest in VA's Equal Employee Opportunity, or EEO, structure. Specifically, the alignment of the agency EEO director in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Human Resources and Administration. VA did not concur with GAO's recommendation to realign EEO director, a deficiency identified by the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee, or EEOC. Removing this potential conflict of interest seems simple to me. However, I understand the department believes it is complicated, so I would like to explore why that is. Another area of concern, and one not discussed in the GAO report, is the timeliness of EEO cases. According to the most recent No Fear data reported by VA, it takes an average roughly of 1,100 days to process an EEO complaint when the employee requests a hearing before the EEOC. I understand that some of this time is attributed to the EEOC, but 3 years to process a complaint does not inspire confidence that the system is working efficiently or effectively. In fact, according to GAO, the 2016 Merit System Protection Board survey found that only 47% of VA employees felt that their charges of sexual harassment would be resolved in a fair and just manner. I hope today to explore the ways in which we can increase trust in the system and reduce the time it takes to render a fair and just decision. I now want to turn to patient harassment. It is evident from the testimony submitted in this case that patient-on-patient harassment occurs frequently and affects women at higher rates. No veteran deserves to suffer the indignities that were described in the testimony. Moreover, we know that 1 in 4 female veterans and 1 in 100 male veterans screen positive for military sexual trauma. After the recent tragic death of Vanessa Guillen, an Army soldier stationed at Fort Hood, who was sexually harassed and then brutally murdered by a fellow service member, many more Service women and women veterans have come forward about the abuse and the harassment they experienced while serving in uniform. It is unacceptable that they might come to VA, a place intended to heal, and experience similar harassment and abuse by their fellow veterans and or VA employees. I take from the VA's written testimony a tacit acknowledgement that VA can and must do better to create a safe and welcoming environment for all veterans. Colonel Powers, I don't have to tell you the importance of the initiative when attacking problems, when you have to take initiative. As the second most senior employee at the department, you have the power to gain the initiative and make real and meaningful change. Veterans, employees, and stakeholders are listening, and they are counting on you. Before my time expires, I would be remiss if I did not recognize that today is Colonel Powers' first time testifying before this committee. Welcome, and I just want to let you know that did you graduate from Prior Lake High School? Okay, first of all, the new one or the old one?
The old one.
Because the old one was actually located in Prior Lake. The new one is located in Savage.
That's what I heard.
Where I grew up, and we used to beat Prior Lake regularly on the
I don't know about
basketball
that.
court. But the point is, it was one of those competitions that when it was over, we went all out, enjoyed ice cream together.
Most definitely.
And that's how it should be. So thank you for being here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, General Bergman. I could go for some ice cream after the hearing today, and I'm sure you all agree. But we welcome you, Deputy Secretary Powers, and are pleased that you're here. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Chairwoman Julia Brownlee of the Women Veterans Task Force for 5 minutes of opening comments.
Well, thank you, Chairman Pappas, for holding this very important hearing today and including the Women's Veterans Task Force and its voice, most importantly, to the hearing. Yesterday, I stood outside the Capitol with my colleagues and women veterans who are demanding justice for servicewomen and women veterans following the murder of Specialist Vanessa Guillen. Guillen told her family that she was being sexually harassed by a fellow soldier before she went missing in April. This story resonates with millions of women veterans who have experienced so much trauma and violence at the hands of those who are supposed to have their backs. That includes their experiences at the VA, the agency that is responsible for providing health care and benefits to survivors of sexual violence must be a safe place for all who enter its doors. Today, we will discuss the prevalence of sexual harassment within the VA. Much of today's hearing will focus on findings of the Government Accountability Office report that found that inconsistent and incomplete policies and information hinder VA's efforts to protect their employees. The results of the report, to me, are alarming. I was stunned to learn that the policy and accountability shortfalls regarding harassment of employees are nearly identical to those regarding sexual harassment of veteran patients. While I welcome VA's acceptance of 6 of GAO's 7 recommendations to address employee harassment, I share my colleagues' concern that the timeliness stated to implement these recommendations will take far too long. Women employees and women veterans have shared their experiences of sexual and gender harassment within VA's walls for years. And we also know that Black women and LGBTQ veterans are disproportionately impacted. 1 in 4 women veterans experience sexual or gender harassment at VA medical facilities across the country. 1 in 3 Black women veterans experience sexual harassment in medical facilities across the country. These numbers are probably far higher because VA does not mandate reporting of sexual harassment complaints. In their statement for the record, Paralyzed Veterans of America shared the story of one of their women veteran members whose physical limitations made her particularly vulnerable when she was sexually harassed by a male veteran in her hospital room. This kind of trauma causes at least 20% of women veterans to delay or skip entirely seeking life-saving health care. We are out of time, and we need corrective action now. If it's a resourcing issue, I expect that the VA will share with us and with the appropriators what they need to meet a more accelerated timeline. While I want to recognize the efforts of many in the VA, I must also highlight a contradiction in VA's testimony, which says, quote, Secretary Wilkie emphasized during his first few weeks as secretary and again in December in his annual message to all staff, VA will not tolerate behaviors that create an intimidating, offensive, or hostile environment, end quote. Yet we still have a culture of misogyny, which in turn continues to create an environment of intimidation and hostility for too many women veterans and women employees. In statements for the record for today's hearing, multiple veteran service organizations highlighted the case of a woman veteran who happens to be on my staff. In September, while on her way to an appointment, she was sexually harassed and assaulted at the Washington, D.C. VA. Even though the incident took place in a public space, she had to report to 4 different VA employees before the police were called. Survivors of military sexual trauma feel this statement as an attack on all survivors because they don't feel heard, they feel disrespected, and they feel the wholesale lack of recognition that sexual harassment still occurs at an unacceptable rate within the VA, and that the old boys club culture that devalues women persists. Additionally, women VA employees are also still experiencing high levels of sexual and gender harassment. A 2016 Merit System Protection Board survey found that the VA had the second highest rate of sexual harassment of women employees in the entire executive branch at 26%. Yet between 2016 and 2018, the VA only resolved 15 cases of sexual harassment. The House acted on this issue in November when we passed my bill, the Deborah Sampson Act. The House version includes a provision that would substantively address sexual harassment and assault at VA. We still need Senate action on this bill. This GAO report makes it clear what needs to be done. Inconsistent and incomplete policies are putting employees, patients, caregivers, and anyone else on VA's property at risk. Without an honest, clear, and genuine recognition of the problem from the top, a successful fail-safe system with accountability measures built into every step along the way, it will never happen. We need a system in place now, not years from now, and the VA must begin today to approach this issue with a real sense of urgency. I look forward to today's testimony from the VA, GAO, and disabled American veterans, and a productive discussion on this critically important issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairwoman Brownlee. I would now like to recognize Chairman Takano, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for any opening comments he might have.
Thank you, Chairman Pappas. I first want to note the importance of this hearing. The subcommittee and the Women's Veterans Task Force have focused much-needed attention on the ongoing and widespread problem of sexual harassment experienced at VA facilities. I recognize that the department has made progress. However, I must echo what Chairman Pappas and others have stated. We need to see VA leadership take many more steps and in a timely manner toward effective policies and procedures. As shown by the GAO in its report on VA sexual harassment released last week, ineffective policies not only mean that fewer employees have the protection they need, but the very mission of VA is hindered. GAO, in its report released last week, pointed out many failings by VA in their efforts to address sexual harassment, including that not all allegations by employees are being reported through any sort of centralized system. In other words, there is a severe undercounting of allegations that are reported, let alone that result in inaction by the department. Now, this is not the first time GAO has raised similar concerns. There was a 1993 GAO report titled quote, inquiry into sexual harassment issues at selected VA medical centers, end quote. Let me say that again. A 1993 GAO report. Now that GAO report specifically pointed out the importance of full reporting of allegations through a central system, as well as mandatory sexual harassment training and other steps similar to what we are hearing about today. VA employees simply cannot wait for years or even too many months before the GAO recommendations are implemented and other steps are taken. I also note that the department is not working effectively with organized labor in order to address sexual harassment. Labor unions can be an asset in working with and communicating with employees. They are also a valuable form of protection and support. I urge VA to engage with organized labor on this issue. So I look forward, Secretary Powers, to your testimony and appreciate your participation in these proceedings today. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you, Chairman Takano. I will now introduce the witnesses we have on our first panel. We have Ms. Pamela Powers, Acting Deputy Secretary at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and she is accompanied by Mr. Dan Sitterly, Assistant Secretary of Human Resources and Administration and Operations Security and Preparedness, Dr. Patricia Hayes, Chief Consultant of Women's Health Services at the Office of Patient Care Services at the Veterans Health Administration, and Ms. Leela Jackson, Senior Strategist for the Office of the Chief of Staff at the Veterans Health Administration. Ms. Powers will provide testimony for all of the VA witnesses. I remind you to please pause for 2 to 3 seconds before you begin speaking so that the recording will capture all of your words, and please remember to do so when answering members' questions as well. Thanks very much, and Ms. Powers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. As General Bergman said, this is my first testimony in front of this committee, but it's also my first testimony in front of any committee. So I'd ask you to go easy on me, but I know that probably won't be the case. But Chairman Pappas, Chairwoman Brownlee, Chairman Takano, Ranking Member Bergman, and members of this subcommittee and the task force, thank you for inviting me to discuss the critically important topic of making sure VA provides a safe and welcome environment for our patients, their families, and our staff. I know you all are familiar with the GAO report about sexual harassment in the government, which said that incidents happened more frequently at VA than any other federal agency. But today I want to walk you through the steps that VA has taken since that GAO data was collected in 2016 at the end of the last administration, and describe to you how VA is not the same VA as it was 4 years ago. Ensuring VA is an ethical and accountable organization that has a welcoming and safe environment is something that Secretary Wilkie does take very seriously. In his first few weeks on the job in 2018, Secretary Wilkie sent the message right from the top that VA will not tolerate any behavior that creates an intimidating, offensive, or hostile environment. And he has reaffirmed that directive each year to our staff, and he consistently sets an ethical tone from the top. This is incredibly important to me as well. As a 30-year veteran, this is personal. And I also use VA healthcare, so it's personal. It is of utmost importance to me that we have an organization that I am proud to share with my brothers and sisters in arms. To that end, we have ongoing, targeted customer service efforts and employee engagement efforts, enhancements to training, policies and programs, and significant outreach to our women veterans. Just a few weeks ago, I hosted a virtual Women's Summit with more than 1,600 women veterans, and that was followed up by 2 other virtual events that reached almost 200,000 women, and it allowed us to answer over 1,000 questions. We also have a dedicated women's call center that has made 1.7 million outreach calls since inception. Last year, we launched a national campaign to prevent all harassment in VA. And this campaign includes increased training for our medical and support staff, to include our police officers, and to ensure they are aware of inappropriate behavior and have the tools to stop it, report it, and prevent it. That campaign includes the distribution of information for veterans and visitors on how to treat everyone with respect in our facilities. Also last year, we launched the VHA Harassment and Assault Policy and Reporting Task Force to improve our system of reporting and tracking of sexual harassment and assault, but also to improve the services that we offer to targets of this mistreatment. It's not just about tracking these incidents, it's about taking action to make sure they don't happen again. And because we can always improve, and because we are a learning organization, we welcome the GAO report. We concurred with virtually all of its recommendations and are already in the process of updating our policies in this area, reviewing training requirements, and finalizing harassment prevention programs. And based on the results that we've seen so far in VA, especially over the last couple years, we are optimistic that our efforts are making a difference. We're serving more women veterans than ever before, and we now treat more than 550,000 women, which is more than 3 decades, 3 times the number we cared for 2 decades ago. Women increasingly trust VA. In the second quarter of this fiscal year, we saw women's trust in VA jump 10 percentage points from last year to a record high. And there is strong evidence that the culture is changing for our women employees. Our efforts to improve employee experience, retention, and morale has helped VA boost its rating from 17th out of 18 best places to work in large federal organizations to 6th in a few short years. That's a significant jump. We know women employees are a big part of this changing culture because they're not a minority in VA. 60% of our 400,000 employees are women, and women are also managing key aspects of this large organization. But while we're seeing progress, culture change is not something an organization pursues for just a few weeks or just a few short years. It is a constant undertaking, and the VA is committed to cultural change for the long haul. So every woman who wears our nation's uniform knows that this is her VA. Thank you, and I am happy to answer your questions and discuss this very important topic.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Powers, and a reminder to my colleagues that members should pause 2 to 3 seconds before speaking so that all of your questions are captured. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Secretary Powers, thanks very much for your testimony here today, and I can gather from your comments that it's fair to say there's a lot more work ahead to address the widespread problem of sexual harassment at VA facilities. Would you agree?
I would say it's an ongoing process, but we've certainly addressed it a lot over these last couple years. We've done a lot.
So I
I'd be
appreciate
happy to work
that. And
with
the timelines that are outlined in the department's response to GAO recommendations, I believe, extend far too out into the future. Establishing plans of action and handbooks won't be completed until some point next year. Changes involving the managers charged with reporting sexual harassment will not see completion until 2024. I joined 8 of my colleagues in a letter to the Secretary asking that the department expedite implementation of GAO's recommendations. And I want to know what can be done to implement these improvements more quickly.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. VA, we're working to implement the GAO's recommendations, and on the realignment of the EEO program managers to our Assistant Secretary for HR and A. We started that process in 2017. Our National Cemetery Administration is complete. They've already realigned. Our Office of IT, or OIT, has also realigned. Our Veterans Benefits Agency, or administration, is about halfway through, and so we're working with them. But the large part of our organization, as you may know, as you well know, is our Veterans Health Administration. And we have to realign 134 EEO program managers from VHA to HR&A, and that comes with it resource requirements. That comes out of our Gen Ed budget, which historically keeps, unfortunately, getting cut. In fact, I think in the MARC, we just got another $59 million cut in our Gen Ed. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that that Gen Ed budget isn't overhead, headquarters wasted, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It is specific enterprise programs such as EEO that we really need that funding for. We believe that that's a priority. We do want to move that over, but the reason why it'll take till 2024 is because first we need the resource to do that, and then we need to hire all 134 of those folks or bring them over from VHA, which takes time.
So I appreciate that. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that realignment has happened in other areas of VA, and we're still focused on VHA. And I still think we can do better than 2024. You mentioned the resource issue. I think this committee would be happy to work with you to advocate for those additional resources. But you need to be clear with us what you need and how we can work together to cut down that time frame, because people are waiting and people are experiencing harassment today. And I know you take that seriously. And I think 4 years is too long.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do take it seriously, and I would say that we're still addressing it with the current alignment. I think it just is more, it makes more sense to realign it under our HRNA. And as far as the one area that we disagree with the GAO, that is the alignment of the EEO director. And actually, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Siddeley in a second, but the reason why we believe that GAO and EEO have this wrong is in their recommendation, they say that the agency responsible for executing and advising on personnel processes and personnel matters should not be the EEO director, because it creates a conflict of interest, and we completely agree with that, which is why it makes sense to align it under HRNA. Unlike,
before we go there, could I
yeah.
just request that you provide us with specifics about budgetary or other needs
Sure.
to cut down on that 2024 timeframe. I hope we can work together on that. And I note I filed an amendment to Military Construction Veterans Affairs Appropriations to specifically address EEO realignment for VHA. But we need to hear from you in real time about how we can refine this and partner on the efforts that need to be undertaken. So I appreciate that. My time is running out. And I just wondered if we could get to that issue of EEO HR leadership. I think you were wanting to turn it over to Mr. Siddeley, but this is the one area where we didn't receive concurrence, and I would just like an explanation from you as why not.
Mr. Chairman, I was talking about the fact that our HRNA doesn't oversee personnel actions. They are a policy arm of the department. In many organizations, and I think in the private sector, the HRNA typically does that hiring and firing. In our case, our HR personnelists work for the administrations, and to move that EEO director underneath one of those administrations creates even more of a conflict. And even to move it up a layer to myself, I am the appeal authority, and I am also the decision authority.
Now. Thanks so much, and everyone, please bear with us.
And I'm also the decision authority, so it creates more of a conflict of interest. Mr. Siddeley, do you have anything else to add to that?
Thank you, Deputy. The only thing I would add, Mr. Chairman, is we didn't take this non-concur lightly when we made it. We want to have collectively with the GAO, with you, and with the EEOC, the very best EEO program in the federal government. That said, every federal agency is sort of a handmade wooden shoe when it comes to the way that it's organized, and its department heads, the way we have administrations, the different headquarters, different missions. In the VA, as we go forward and look at our constituency, we have 10 million people covered under the VA EEO program, including our employees, our veterans, our affiliates, our trainees. And so I'm open to a different structure than what we currently have, but as the deputy suggested, we don't really know what that looks like to not create additional conflict under the structure that we have today. So I look forward to working with this committee, with the EEOC, with GAO. I understand that there are about 66% is what I'm told of agencies that comply with that EEOC directive. That means 34% of us believe we have it right in a different structure. So I'd be very happy to have that dialogue as we go forward.
Thanks. I'm sure this will be a point of conversation. My time's up. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Bergman for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of want to put a capstone comment to make sure I understand the chairman's last question and your all's response. In organizational terms, what I heard you say, HR in the VA is more policy-oriented, vice operational.
Yes, sir.
And I can understand if that is in fact the case. So I guess not to be answered now, but to be contemplated and thought for future conversation, is HR long-term in the VA? Should it stay policy as it relates to other agencies across the spectrum of federal government? Because if you're trying to have a meeting and the HR folks show up and one agency sends its policy folks and another agency sends its operational folks, we automatically have a disconnect. So I'm appreciative of your education for, at least for me on this case, of where we differ. And there is a difference between policy making staffs and all of that and the operational side of running the business. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about the EEO process. Mr. Sitterly, as the department's EEO director, I would like to ask you about the EEO process. According to the data posted on VA's website, the average days pending for an employee's EEO complaint in which a hearing was requested is over 1,100 days. I imagine that an employee could lose faith in the process, let alone track of what's going on over that course of time, waiting 3 years for resolution of a sexual harassment complaint. Would you please help me understand why the EEO process takes so long? What steps are within the VA's control? What steps are outside the VA's control? And what is the VA doing to, it's one thing to improve timeliness, but you cannot forsake quality just because you did it faster. So please elaborate.
Thank you for the question, General Bergman. I too am very frustrated with the time that it takes. I'll try to walk you through as quickly as I can which part we have responsibility for and which part we turn over to other agencies. So first of all, we would very much like to prevent it from happening in the first place. When that doesn't happen, within 45 days under the current policy and EEO guidance, the individual reports that to our EEO office. We then have 30 days to meet with the individual and attempt to resolve that. The fact is, we have over 50% of the cases that come to us, we call those informal, that are actually resolved. The other 50% have the opportunity to go to dispute resolution. We very much like to have that resolution done. That gives us another 90 days. So the part that I control is 90 days of the resolution, up to 90 days. In the 30 days to investigate, if you will. At that point, if the individual doesn't accept the resolution, we give them notice that they have the authority to go to the EEOC or other avenues for complaint. Once it goes to the EEOC and administrative judges for hearings, I lose all of that. And so our goal is to have everything resolved informally, and the more timely that individuals come to us and the more dispute resolution that we can do, the better we are at that. But once it's turned over to the EEOC, then I will defer to them to answer what.
Okay, I just want to, because I know my time is running short here,
Yes,
but
sir.
what I heard you say was 50% of the cases are resolved.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so then the remainder of 50%, you get your work done within 90 days.
That is correct, sir.
Okay, of that remaining 50%, what percentage of that goes past the 90 days and goes into the, the tunnel to nowhere?
So it depends on the individual, and the individual gets to select what their next course of action is, either to go to the EEOC or to another office to complain with that. But frankly, if the claim is accepted, and not all of them are accepted, that's up to the EEOC to accept. That is, it fits their category of timeliness. It's one of the protected categories, those sorts of things. Then it will go to the EEOC, and we will track it through its finish, but we don't see it from that point until they make a final decision.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Chairwoman Brownlee for 5 minutes.
And I think I wanted to ask a couple of questions of the Secretary. So, and again, you've done a great job so far, so hang in there. It's not so bad. But during a visit to Philadelphia, my staff went to a site visit in Philadelphia and found that a lot of the anti-harassment posters had been taken down from public spaces, and that they might be creating a hostile environment for women veterans and women that these posters had been taken down, and it was actually the male veterans who were taking them down because they feared that they were being blamed for sexual harassment and that sort of insinuation. And so my question is really, are you seeing this? And certainly it happened in Philadelphia. And I guess the question is, how is VA addressing a pushback like that from veteran men who take anti-harassment messages sort of as personal criticism?
That's unfortunate, ma'am. I'm not aware of that, but I'll certainly look into that, after this hearing. We do take that very seriously. While I do not believe we have a systemic issue of harassment in VA, I do know that it happens. Some male veterans do not treat our female veterans well. But I would say that we have an older generation of veterans, primarily older generation that we serve in our VA hospitals. They served at a time when there weren't a lot of women in uniform. I'm not making excuses for them, certainly not. But what I'm saying is I can't change the mind of that 75-year-old, but I can certainly, and we in VA can certainly address the behavior, which is why we stood up that task force, and it's why that we have this Stop Harassment Now campaign. And actually, Ms. Jackson, would you like to talk a little bit more about that campaign?
I only have a little bit of time, so I hear what you're saying, but I think that I'm only citing one experience in Philadelphia, but my sense is that there's more of this peppered throughout the VA, and I think it, and I bring it up because I think it is, as you pursue more training, that sort of thing, I think this needs to be, incorporated. It is certainly for all employees, but I think there has to be sort of a focus on this behavior, and because even if somebody is 75 years old, if they can see that they're actually acting that way, they want to fix it, but they don't see that they're actually acting that way. And so I think through, different simulations and so forth in training, we can correct some behaviors. The other question that I really wanted to get to is the issue of, okay, so we're all accepting the prevalence of employee harassment at the VA. You're testifying that you're already undertaking a lot of steps towards addressing this. I just have to ask why in the last 3 years that were only 15 cases of employee harassment have resulted in corrective action. And I just just need to understand, when we know that 1 in 4 women experience sexual harassment, that only over this period of time, only 15 cases have been corrected. So to me, that just underscores maybe some of the pitfalls within the past processes, of addressing this issue. There's got to be more than 15 cases. I mean, it just, when you look at all of the statistics, there is no way that it can just be 15. Mm-hmm. So, if you could just address that.
Madam Chair, I agree that we definitely need to address it. It's one of the reasons why we stood up a task force last year to look at how we report and encourage those to come forward. we know that it's underreported. We know that not everyone that experiences harassment comes forward, but we want our veterans and we want our staff to come forward. Dan Sitterly and his team on the EEO side have led a multi-department effort as well with tabletop exercises and are really looking into the reporting structures and our training as well, and whether or not we have the right training. The GAO report didn't say that we don't have training. It said that we have a lot of old training and it's not consistent. And that's really where we're focusing on our efforts. We hired a chief learning officer under the CHICO, I believe it's under the CHIFO. And Dan Sitterly can talk a little bit more about that, but that learning officer is gonna look at learning across the entire department and whether or not we have it right. And we wanna be focused because we know our employees' time is valuable and we wanna have that right training. But back to your earlier comment, I wanna talk a little bit about the bystander training that we just stood up, that we started the contract kicked off in July. That bystander training is gonna be for our veterans and for our staff to identify what harassment looks like and to prevent it and stop it and really take care of it. So we've got a lot of efforts underway. We just need to make sure that they're focused.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for exceeding my time limit, but I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Brownlee. Next, I'd like to recognize Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes, and I'll just remind you, Ms. Radewagen, to pause 2 or 3 seconds before you begin your questioning.
So thank you to the chair and the ranking member for holding this hearing today in conjunction with the Women Veterans Task Force. And thank you to witnesses for their testimony. No one should ever be made to feel uncomfortable due to their sex or gender, period. I acknowledge that this can be a delicate topic with both personal and legal ramifications. Out of respect for those who've been the victims of sexual harassment or assault, I hope we can all approach this in a level-headed and appropriate manner. That said, there can be zero tolerance for certain types of behaviors, least of all in facilities meant to serve and heal our nation's heroes. Colonel Powers, in 2012, Congress directed VA to implement a policy on the reporting and tracking of sexual assault and other safety incidents that occur at VA medical centers. Here we are 8 years later, still wrestling with the data collection issue. What is VA doing to capture information about sexual harassment, including sexual assault on VA property?
Thank you for that question. I would agree that we were still wrestling with it. It was about 1.5 years ago where I was looking at the congressional report that was coming forward, and I didn't understand the numbers, and the numbers didn't make sense. And I understood that half of them were not even assaults by veterans that had the mental capacity, which is why we stood up this task force to really look into that. And it's also why, and Ms. Jackson, if you could talk about the sexual assault dashboard that we have now in place.
We just stood up we just launched the sexual assault incident reporting dashboard because we were concerned about our CMR report from last year. We had 228 allegations of sexual assault out of the 107 million veterans appointments, inpatient and outpatient visits. So we were concerned and we wanted to understand it. So we established this dashboard that gives us clarity on was it an employee on employee, was it veteran on veteran? If there was no charges filed, why not? Was it because the victim decided not to prosecute? Was it because the suspect was incapacitated? And then we track it all the way through victim recovery. We want to know, what are we doing to help the victim? So we are really getting at trying to understand it, and we want to reduce our numbers. I'm a Marine veteran. I care about this also very passionately.
I don't know if I have enough time for another question. I can't
You have
see
2 minutes.
how
Go right
many
ahead.
minutes are left. But my question here is for Mr. Sitterly. Mr. Sitterly, the GAO found that the policies in the field did not always reflect the current VA policy on sexual harassment. To address that, GAO recommended that the Office of Resolution Management should review all existing VA and administration policies to make sure that they're current, complete, and aligned with VA sexual harassment policy. Is the process so dissimilar at each VA facility that different processes or policies are required? Seems that other than the name of a point of contact, the policy and procedures should be the same across VA.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. First of all, let me be perfectly clear. There is one single document that is the overarching policy in the VA, and that's the document that Secretary Wilkie signs out every year. That's important because every other policy document in the VA comes from that. It's also important because it's the policy document from which all of our training is established. And I think what I would like everybody to know that 95+% of all our employees today, as of this day, have taken that training and have reviewed this document, which talks about how to report, what the expectations are, et cetera. That said, I do think that there have been a lot of efforts across the VA in a lot of different areas, and that we need to have a central location, and that's what the deputy has asked us to do, is to stand up this task force. In the past, we have had employee focus was in my office in ORM. Our patients were in patient advocacy offices. Our police were reporting assault incidents. We have a workplace violence prevention, insider threat, and there were a lot of places across the VA. And so the task force that the deputy is leading and has tasked us to look at will bring all of those together so that we can have a central place to not only record, but more importantly, to investigate and to take action, and perhaps even most importantly, to ensure that our victims are given the care that is appropriate for the situation. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Radewagen. And now I'll recognize Chairman Takano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pappas. Deputy Secretary Powers, as I said in my opening statement, welcome, and I hope this is not going to be too jarring for you, this first experience. So it really is good to see you here. Your testimony made clear your sentiment to make addressing sexual harassment at VA a priority, and I appreciate your intention and that of your department colleagues who have joined you for moving VA forward. However, VA employees need strong, timely action if we are going to have an agency where everyone is safe from sexual harassment. I joined with 8 of my congressional colleagues in writing to the Secretary urging that VA implement the recommendations made by GAO in its report on sexual harassment. Several of those who signed the letter are here today, including Chairman Pappas, Ranking Member Bergman, as well as Chairwoman Brownlee, and Chairwoman Custer, who is not here. The other signatures include full committee ranking member Dr. Rowe, as well as the chair and ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee and Senator Ernst. Now that's quite a list. All of us agreed on the importance of the issue and the validity of the recommendations and the need for VA to expedite the timetable for implementation. Now, Ms. Powers, I heard your response to Chairman Pappas when he asked you about your timetable for implementation. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, I have to ask, why can't we move more quickly? For example, we all agree that improved training can and should be required for VA employees, but the department does not plan on making the new training module available till the end of next year. Please explain why the delay.
Yes, Chairman, thank you for that question. Training is important. Every hour that we spend, takes away from patient care that we could be providing to patients. So we have to make sure, as an organization, that we have the right training at the right time. And that's why we hired a Chief Learning Officer. Mr. Sidley, can you talk a little bit about the effort that we have underway to make sure that we have focused training in this area?
Excuse me, I'm not really wanting to sit through about why we need this training. I perfectly understand why we need the training, and you alluded to the to the excuse, which is you're going to take people away from patient care, and that you need the right training materials. But I'm sorry, I read you a statement from 1993 GAO report. It took you since 1993 to come up with training materials. So I mean,
Mr. Chairman,
I'm
Dan.
growing impatient with this.
Dan, if I can just comment on one point on that. It's not a problem of not having training. We have training. We have too much training. We don't have consistent training. We have an overarching training policy, but then every administration has developed their own. Some of it's outdated, some of it's not needed. So unless I'm missing something, Mr. Sitterly, that's really the problem, is we need to make sure that this is focused.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, like I talked about the policy, everybody's working hard to ensure that we get this right. There has been a hesitancy to fund the general administration account so that we have oversight across the entire VA to do this. And so we are concerned, as the deputy said, is that not that we don't have enough training, we have too much training. And we've allowed everybody to put the training out.
So, Mr. Sillig, are you telling me that you were asking Congress to fund specifically the general account you just mentioned, with maybe a proviso saying that this money is kind of specifically got to be spent on this training? Is that you've been lacking that funding to be able to do this?
Sir, the $59 million cut that the deputy mentioned earlier affects my ability to do police force modernization. It affects my ability to do Section 505 of the Mission Act so that we can put a manpower management system in place. It also affects our ability to do labor negotiations. So the money that comes into the general administration account all is spent in manpower, if you will, with the exception of leases and copier paper and those sorts of things. And so, yes, we have allowed this to be distributed out across. We have, in our talent management system, which is our system of primary training for the VA, we have 285 courses that address workplace violence. We have 130 courses that address disruptive behaviors. The deputy has charged us with ensuring that we get our arms around what is the right training to the right people at the right time, so that we have deliberate, not only how-tos, but what-ifs on all of this training. And to the point, 1 hour of mandatory training across 400,000 employees is 400,000 hours that they don't get to contact our veterans. And so we want to make sure that we don't add to it. We want to make sure, frankly, that we have less, but that it's just in time, it's micro-learning. And so we're working very hard to do that, along with the bystander intervention training, the national provider training, and such.
Well, Mr. Sa- I'm over my time, but I just want to suggest that I suggest the timetable is too far out for, I think, members of Congress. We don't understand why it has to be so far out. And if you need more money, I think you need to come back and tell us this is what we need, because in order to get the sexual harassment and be held accountable for it, because this is a high priority for both sides of the aisle. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Bost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Powers, in your testimony, you highlighted the increased confidence in the number of veterans using the VA services, which is wonderful. However, with that increase in the number of veterans coming into the VA for medical care, what exactly is the VA doing to have a concrete, definitive policy in place to reduce the amount of patient-on-patient sexual harassment?
Thank you for that question. We have a lot of efforts underway. The reason why I'm very optimistic, but I'm not satisfied, is we, on the optimistic side, our trust scores among our veterans have increased dramatically over the last couple of years. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, they've gone up among our women veterans 10% just in this last year. We survey a lot of our veterans. We have a large population after every appointment. I'm one of them. As I mentioned earlier, I get my health care in VA, and I received a survey right afterwards. And I would say that we had 17.8% response rate, which is industry standard is about 10%. And so we're pretty confident in our numbers that our veterans trust the health care that they are getting and that it's in a safe and welcoming environment. 87% of our women trust the health care that they're getting. But we're not stopping there. It's not, we are continually transforming this department to meet the needs of all of our veterans.
Okay, I think you kind of, well, let me go on, and when I tell you that I'm going to go down the same path as the chairman and also the whole committee chairman, and I think, you know, we don't want to beat a dead horse, but this one's going to get beat, okay? And here's why. I really need to understand this, because we all have to answer to our constituents. And our constituents are veterans and all of those that have VA facilities. And when you get recommendations and you agree with the recommendations, and then you say it's going to take to 2024 to put in the changes necessary, the constituents that I deal with, that I have to talk to, I think they think that there is rocket time, there is standard time, there is turtle time, and then there's bureaucracy time. And the problem with bureaucracy time is no one can understand why it is that the federal government always has to take too long to implement so many things that are vitally important. And this is vitally important. And we're asking these questions because we, even as members of Congress, which doesn't move quick, are having trouble trying to figure out why the VA is going to take this long to implement the changes necessary on such a vital issue. And I don't know how to get the answers that we need to go back to our constituents and say, yes, we are dealing with this. 2024, we're dealing with it.
Mr. Bost, I would say that there's only one aspect of the GAO recommendations that are going to take till 2024, and that is what we talked about earlier, realigning those Veteran Health Administration employees under Dan Sitterly in HR&A. We can't do that without the budget to do so, and we can't do that with the current budget, and we've made that request in our budget proposal. The rest of the recommendations we're already moving out on, and they won't take that long. The training we just talked about, but I would like to go back to the problem at hand is sexual assault and sexual harassment, and we want to make sure that this organization has a zero tolerance policy. We have a very targeted effort on not only employee engagement, but also veteran experience. On the employee engagement side, we have an entire effort. We do an all-employee survey every year, and it asks a lot of questions of our employees, and it shows what the culture is in every single small organization within VA, and we hold our leaders accountable from those scores. They're on all of our SCSs, our senior leaders' reports every year. And we have an entire office, the National Center for Organizational Development, that is there to help those leaders of underperforming organizations build up that culture and be better. They give them the tools and resources. So we track this very closely. Every time I go to a facility around our nation, it's one of the things I look for. I look at the culture. I look at the Women's Health Center and making sure. I look at the posters on the walls to make sure that they have those up there. On the veterans experience side, the reason why we see such progress and the reason why I'm very optimistic with that we're moving in the right direction is our scores have jumped up a lot because we have such a targeted veteran experience office. We have an entire office. Dr. Linda Davis and her team are doing fantastic things to make sure we provide world-class customer service. So we know right away where our issues are, and that's another thing we track very closely. So I would say that it's a culture change. It's multifaceted, a lot of efforts underway, but I am very optimistic.
Okay. Well, my time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Next up, I have Ms. Rice for 5 minutes, and I would just remind Ms. Rice to pause 2 or 3 seconds before you begin your questioning, and I'll now recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Powers, you recently issued a response to a letter that Chairman Takano, Representative Brownlee, and I sent to Secretary Wilkie calling for the VA's exclusionary motto to be updated. I was extremely disappointed by your letter, which not only dismissed our request, but questioned the notion that the motto could at all be interpreted as discriminatory. I have met with women veterans who told me that the current motto makes them feel invisible at VA, and it exemplifies a culture and environment that does not equally recognize or respect their service. These women were made to feel like their service and experiences didn't matter to you and to the VA. This creates a lack of trust in a system that is supposed to be there to support these women. I believe this issue is important and relevant to raise at today's hearing on sexual harassment in the department because it speaks to a cultural problem that continues to exist within the VA. The prevalence of sexual harassment within VA facilities is a significant barrier to care for women veterans. Women VA employees also experience high levels of sexual and gender harassment, and many employees do not report harassment because of fear of retaliation or reprisal. Cultural change starts at the top, and there is still work to be done to show veterans and VA employees that the agency and its leadership are committed to taking harassment seriously. So, Ms. Powers, I want to give you a chance to update the remarks you made in your letter. Are you prepared today to recognize that the current VA motto is exclusionary of women and LGBTQ veterans?
Thank you for that question. I think this is a very important issue. I believe, our motto is based upon a direct quote from Lincoln's second inaugural address some 150 years ago. We've heard from women on both sides of this issue. Personally, I see the quote for what it is. It was a speech, perhaps one of the greatest speeches of our entire history, from a president who sought to heal a divided nation. And if you look at the entire speech, he talked about equity for all and not just some, which is at the heart of this matter. And I believe that what matters more than the words on our building from a president, one of the best presidents we've ever had, what matters more is what happens when our veterans walk through our doors, and whether or not our women get the gender-specific care, or whether or not they are welcome and feel safe. And that is where we're focusing our efforts.
Ms. Powers, that is the problem. When you walk in and you see that motto and you are a woman, you immediately feel like you don't belong there. I recently spoke to a number of women veterans who explained what it's like to walk into a VA hospital and see those words, and then immediately, before they even make it to the elevator to go up to the women's area of the hospital, they are subject to constant harassment. So the point is that even though when Abraham Lincoln spoke those words, women were serving the military. They might not have been on the battlefield, but they were certainly serving in other capacities. So why Lincoln chose that word is, obviously those are the words that he spoke. But over the course of history, we have changed mottos and ideas and policies. As time changes, women are serving more. More than 2 million women have worn the uniform of this great country of ours. And it seems ridiculous that the only reason not to change it that I have heard is that these are the words of Abraham Lincoln, who, as you said, was one of our greatest presidents. So you can imagine how upsetting it was then to hear Mr. Wilkie speak about, respond to a specific question I asked about his support for the change in the motto. And he said, it's going to cost too much money, which is ridiculous. It has not been scored by CBO, but to say that is ridiculous, especially since less than 6 months later, he talked about putting up a bronze plaque with the VA motto on it at all 170 VA cemeteries around the country, which would come to me at a hugely significant cost. So it belies his claim that, changing the motto has anything to do with finances. And let me just say that, it's not that difficult to connect the fact that women are not included and recognized in the VA's motto with the fact that they get beyond subpar treatment from their male colleagues. If you ever expect to do anything substantive and address the chronic epidemic of sexual harassment against women and men in the military, you have to start by not just the actions that you take, but the words that represent the very institution that they are charged with defending. So I really hope that you will reconsider your position and stop making reference to words that were spoken many years ago, because the reality of the military in 2020 is very different, and it has to change with the times if we are ever going to give women the kind of equality they deserve for putting their lives on the line, just like their male colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. With that, I'd like to recognize Ms. Underwood for 5 minutes, and just would remind you to pause a couple seconds before you begin your questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel of witnesses. The circumstances surrounding the killing of Specialist Vanessa Guillen are just the most recent reminder that sexual harassment and assault are far too common within our armed forces. We know that these experiences are both personally devastating for women in uniform and a critical threat to our force in readiness and national security. Service members who come home and seek care at the VA should not experience more of the same. And it's our job as members of this committee to make sure that that doesn't happen. In February 2019, VA released a study that found at least 1 in 4 women veterans experience sexual or gender-based harassment at VA facilities. Ms. Powers, do you share my concern that a pervasive culture of sexual harassment within VA may impact military readiness for those women veterans who utilize VHA care but still serve in a reserve or guard capacity?
Yes, I would say that I disagree with the premise that we have pervasive sexual harassment at VA. The data doesn't show that. There are instances in our VA hospitals that we are seeking to address, most definitely, but I do not agree that is pervasive. I do believe that we need to have a culture that is safe and welcoming. That is imperative. No veteran should come into our facility and not feel safe or welcome. That is my goal, and that is what we are focused on, creating that culture to make sure that that happens.
Well, I don't know how we could characterize 1 in 4 women experiencing this kind of harassment and not call it pervasive. But my question is really about the impact on readiness for women veterans who serve in the Guard or in a reserve capacity. And are you all doing anything to address that concern?
I guess I'm misunderstanding your question. We don't see reserve and guard in our VA hospitals. They're not eligible for VA health care.
Okay, moving on. A GAO report from July 2020 found that VA does not require reporting of all sexual harassment complaints. Specifically, the report identified that not all managers who receive complaints may be required to report them to VA centrally. Policies and implementation of VA regulations regarding sexual harassment can also differ by individual facility. How is VA working to ensure that regulations and procedures involving sexual harassment are uniform across your facilities?
Mr. Siddeley, would you like to address that?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to note that the GAO study focused on the employee aspect of it in regards to sexual harassment as a condition of employment and discrimination. And then we have the veteran piece that we're looking at as well. So the task force that the deputy has asked us to look at includes harassment and assault reporting across the entire enterprise, which is why as we shift to bring this under ORM, that's a huge undertaking, and to bring the resources to address both the clinical, the patient care, the employee piece, the dispute resolution. It's handled differently depending upon the constituency. And so we're working that policy together with our administrations, and that's where our harassment prevention policy will come in, that we'll have the interim guidance out next month on. Thank you for the question.
Okay, additionally, that GAO report found that VA has incomplete and outdated policies, information and training related to sexual harassment. Specifically, VA employee training lacks any in-depth information necessary for effectively identifying and addressing sexual harassment. Ms. Powers, what is VA doing to address these glaring holes in the training?
Yes, thank you for the question. I believe we've already answered that, but Actually, Mr. Silly, can you talk a little bit about the targeted training that we're going to be providing?
Yes, thank you. Once again, the overall mandatory training for everybody has been complied by over 90%, 95% of our employees. It's required within 90 days of onboarding. So given the vast surge we've had with employees with the COVID-19, thanks to the efforts of this Congress, that doesn't surprise me that we're 5% of those people behind. So that is our one training that's mandatory for everybody. In addition, we have over 400 courses that address workplace violence to include harassment, assault, disruptive behaviors. And so our effort is to bring all of those courses together now that we have a chief learning officer on board in the VA, and through the Talent Development Council that she's responsible for, where we have representatives from the 3 administrations, the Office of Information and Technology, and the Board of Veterans Affairs, to ensure that we have captured the training with the policy and to deliver it and to the right people at the right place at the right time, in the right lesson objectives to get us where we need to be. Thank you for the question.
Okay, well, it sounds like there's a variety of different work streams and process, and perhaps the next time you come and testify, we can just understand the comprehensive plan. How are we going to get there, and how are we going to get there timely? It's just seems a little bit fragmented at this point, and we're asking the VA to confront this head on, because the epidemic of sexual harassment at the VA is at a critical moral point, and it's a national security failure. I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. Next, I'd like to recognize Ms. Custer for 5 minutes, and just pause for a couple seconds before you begin your questioning.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pappas, and thank you to Chairwoman Brownlee on the Women's Task Force. I very much appreciate you welcoming me back to the committee for this important hearing. I have to say it's a bit depressing when Chairwoman Brownlee and Chairman Takano and I joined the committee in 2013. This was one of the very first issues that we addressed. So change has been slow coming to the VA. When the Merit Systems Protection Board came out with its report 2 years ago, the numbers were simply appalling, and I called for action. I was pleased to work with Ranking Member Bergman to help spur the GAO's report into harassment of the VA workforce, and now with the report in hand, we're in the next step in rectifying the problem. I'm very impressed with the GAO's work on this report. They found glaring problems, and I'm glad that they did not mince words regarding VA sexual harassment policies and the correct course of action. Here's the bottom line. People who go into public service to care for our veterans deserve so much better than the status quo. And the same can be said to our veterans who seek treatment at the VA. I know from having served on this committee for 6 years that the VA simply cannot serve our veterans effectively when staff and patients are victimized at such a pervasive rate. What's really troubling to me is that some of these issues identified by the GAO are similar to those identified when the VA patients complained about harassment that they experienced at VA facilities. Clearly, these lessons need to be learned and taken to heart. Course corrections are needed, and timing is of the essence. So I'll work with my friends and colleagues in the committee, including you, Mr. Chair, to see that this gets done, but the VA should prioritize resolving these issues with greater speed. So Deputy Secretary Powers, last year, my colleague Shelley Pingree and I led a letter to Secretary Wilkie calling on the VA to incorporate input for military sexual trauma survivors and survivor advocates within training for VA staff who process claims concerning MST. Building on that, as the VA looks to move forward on this issue, would you commit to engaging with current and former VA employees who have experienced harassment and incorporate their insights and feedback into all improved or new training to address harassment in the workforce?
Thank you for that question. I am committed to that. I think that we have a comprehensive military sexual assault program in VA. All of our veterans that come to VA are screened for military sexual trauma and for PTSD and other areas. We have an MST coordinator at every VA healthcare system, and eligibility for MST is expansive. You know, our veterans don't have to show that they've had MST. They don't have to be. It doesn't have to be part of their disability. They can come at any time. We don't have a wait. So we want our men and women that have experienced trauma to come.
Training. Excuse me, Secretary Powers, do you have trauma-informed training was the question. And would you include survivors of trauma in your processes?
Actually, this might be a good question for Dr. Hayes. Can you talk through, go ahead and talk through our training.
Yeah, I would like to be able to talk a little bit about, yes, we have trauma-informed training in terms of our sexual assault, sexual harassment. I want to say also that we've been very intense. I see that we have a little delay here. We've worked very hard to include the voice of the veteran in our sexual harassment programs, training. We've had focus groups, but more than that, they've been informing us. And I heard your question about how can we involve employees in the development of these tools. And I can assure you that at the VHA level, the bystander training, the training for frontline staff is very much focused on the employee level involvement. And we do talk with employees in terms of how did this affect them when they're harassed by veterans or by employees. And part of the interactive training captures that. Because one of the most important things we know is that when we talk to veterans who do this behavior, is that the one thing that impacts them is if they understand that what they're doing, it isn't just a political comment or a social comment, it is disrupting the care of their sister veterans. And that's been the impactful message that gets through to them.
Commander recently shared a video message about harassment part in being respectful and welcoming to fellow veterans. In a recent DAV magazine article, DAV National Adjutant also dedicated his column to this important issue, saying none of us should be willing to stand by while a fellow veteran, regardless of gender, faces any type of harassment or disrespect. Respect must begin with each and every one of us. And while VHA's Stand Up to Stop Harassment Now declaration is commendable, we can't rely solely on words. We need action. We recommend VA leadership develop a comprehensive campaign with a strategy for affecting change at all levels of the department and a policy that defines responsibilities and includes staff training to ensure implementation of the plan system-wide. As a first step, we suggest all VA Medical Center leadership make an honest assessment of harassment in their facility and then partner with VSOs and veterans, encouraging them to help recommend solutions to identified problems. For women and minority veterans, harassment is not just an annoyance, but detrimental to their overall health and well-being. For these reasons, we appreciate the subcommittee and the task force attention to this issue and efforts to find viable solutions to end this unacceptable behavior. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you both for your testimony, and we'll begin the questioning portion of this panel, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I just want to thank our GAO and DAV witnesses for being with us today and for your comments. I'm hopeful that you both were here for the first panel and heard the comments from Deputy Secretary Powers. And I'm wondering if I could get your comments on her testimony, specifically to the point of if VA is moving in the right direction, and if so, if they're moving quickly enough to address some of the concerns that you both have. And maybe
I'm happy to
go right ahead.
I'm happy to take a first stab at that question. Certainly, we appreciate VA's efforts that seem to be underway. But like the committee, like the subcommittee has mentioned, a number of you, we certainly have concerns about the length of time that it's taking them to get a policy in place. And I think the ranking member put it nicely that, you know, there's two different issues. One is the harassment issue within VA from an HR and employees issue, but also this issue with veteran on veteran harassment, where we get continued reports, especially impacting women veterans and minority veterans. We want to see VA move expeditiously to address both of these issues at the same time. They have issued a declaration in VHA that they want to stand up to stop harassment now, and they've listed a number of points that they want, which I think would satisfy everyone. But we want to see what are those action plans. We want the VSO community to be involved in those solutions to really get at this problem that needs to happen. So while we appreciate the work that they've started, we want to make sure that they work on getting a plan together to work on this very expeditiously.
Well, thanks for your comments.
We also,
Ms. Barnes, go ahead.
Sure. We also appreciate the work that VA has done, that they have started, and we do commend those efforts. But there's certain efforts such as finalizing their policies, especially with respect to the harassment prevention program, making sure that their central policy is consistent across all of their administrations, and things like that, that we think should be done pretty quickly, as well as looking again at the alignment of their structural issue that they have. This is one where they've been notified several times by the EEOC, and they received a program deficiency notice about this in February. And I know they said they would reach out to the EEOC and consider what they needed to do along those lines. But they have a number of things that they can move out on in a short-term fashion pretty quickly.
Well, I appreciate those comments. And Ms. Barnes, I want to thank you as well for the GAO report on today's hearing topic. It examined many important aspects of VA's sexual harassment policies and procedures and provides the committee with very helpful information, and I hope you'll convey that to all of the staff that was involved in the report. Beyond that, Ms. Barnes, I would like to dive a little bit deeper into the question of the equal employment opportunity leadership. And we raised this with the VA witnesses. Your testimony stated that we should realign its EEO director position to adhere to EEOC's directives. And it seems that VA says the Assistant Secretary of Human Resources in charge doesn't handle sexual harassment and other EEO work on a daily basis, so there's no problem. But can you elaborate a little bit more on whether VA's response makes sense to this question?
Sure. This is just want to point out one, that EEOC is a federal government agency that oversees EEO matters. And this directive structural alignment issue is an EEOC directive. And the problem with it is that when you have the same agency official, even if they're not saying they're personally responsible, but they are responsible for executing and advising on personnel matters and actions, is the same person that's going to be managing and advising and overseeing the EEO complaint process. There's still that appearance or potential conflict of interest there. These functions need to be separate because the EEO's program processes often scrutinize and challenge the motivations and impacts of the personnel decisions. And with the EEOC already pointing out this deficiency several times to the VA, and the EEOC has also agreed to work with them to provide technical assistance. We just think that the VA should get in line with this EEOC directive.
Well, thank you once again for your comments. My time is up. So with that, I would like to turn things over to General Bergman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, before I start, as one of the original requesters of the report, I want to commend and thank GAO for your efforts and what you provided for us, because I know it doesn't have all the answers, but it's certainly going a long way towards getting us to ask the right questions. Ms. Barnes, we kind of go back and forth here on the, where should offices be placed for maximum effectiveness. According to the report, GAO spoke with the EEOC about its concern that the misalignment of the EEO director position in VA. Does the EEOC have a recommendation as to exactly where VA should place the EEO director?
Our understanding is that the EEOC does not have a specific recommendation, but they're willing to provide technical assistance to the VA to help them work through this structural issue. And that technical assistance or that meeting was supposed to have occurred, but we had to finish our work, so we don't know what the status of that, or we don't know if it happened.
Well, when you're providing technical assistance, sometimes you can be a facilitator, not really having an expertise or understanding. You just want to create the conversation. You could be a subject matter expert that potentially could help you help VA to establish a plan of action. Seems like the water's still a little bit muddy there as what do the different entities believe is the correct place for this EEO director position within the VA. Does GAO have an independent recommendation on where VA should place the office?
We don't. Our advice is that they work with EEOC, take them up on that technical advice, and work through that to make sure they can overcome the structural issue.
Okay, it might be interesting, I believe, Mr. Chairman, for the committee to know, even though we deal with Veterans Affairs here, it is a bureaucratic agency of the federal government, for us to see a list of where these offices are placed within the other agencies, whether it's DOL, DOD, whatever it happens to be, to get a comparison. But in the end, we need to get it working, and we need to get it placed where it will be part of solutions, not potentially in either conflict of interest or part of problems inhibiting growth or inhibiting advancement. VA was not in compliance, and Ms. Barnes is still for you, please. VA was not in compliance with the EEOC guidance. Did GAO ask the EEOC whether there were other federal agencies out of compliance and whether cure notices were issued to those agencies?
We didn't ask about other federal agencies. That was outside of the scope of this review, but I'm sure that's something that maybe the VA and EEOC can talk about as kind of a model to help them decide where to place this position.
Okay. I guess, again, it might be helpful to the committee to know if there's any existing data within GAO that, again, reflect other agencies, because to try to build a historical model here to go forward with our recommendations or what we might hope for the VA to do. Ms. Illum, the 2016 MSPB survey found that VA employees reported that 29% of sexual harassment that they experienced was at the hands of the customer/member of the public, which in this case, that means the veterans you represent. Additionally, 25% of female veteran patients reported inappropriate or unwanted comment from other veterans. Would you please expound on what DAV has done and what it is doing to educate its members on their role in making VA a more welcoming place?
Thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my testimony, DAV takes this issue very seriously. And from our leadership on down, we want to make sure that we're conveying the message that this is a problem, it needs to be corrected, and it's going to take all of us to work together to do it. And talking with many of our members, most can't believe that this happens, and they're appalled at this behavior. So we've talked about, what do you do when you see inappropriate behavior? Either report it to someone at the VA or intervene yourself. But don't just stand by and let someone be harassed. It's really going to take all of us to help the same thing. If another veteran sees another veteran harassing a VA employee, the same goes. So we're trying to make sure that people are aware this is a continued problem, and for the veterans that are harassed, it impacts them tremendously. That they're not, going to come back to VA to get the care that they really need, which could be detrimental.
I hate to cut you short, but I'm about a minute over my time. Could I just ask one very quick question? Because this is kind of a yes or no question for Ms. Illum. Does DAV staff at the national and local level receive training on how to assist members to deal with sexual harassment? Does training exist for DAV members?
Well,
yes or no?
We do have our national staff has certain training regarding sexual harassment, but we're looking to VA to partner with VA at VA facilities to be involved in the training that they were talking about, which is doing the scenario training.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Well, thanks for your questions and also your constructive point about what happens in other agencies with that role, and I'd love to take a look at that with you. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Ms. Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first question for me is to Ms. Barnes. And Ms. Barnes, I appreciate your report. There were several things that were very surprising to me in reading the report, but the one thing that jumped out the most for me is around the reporting piece and the fact that there is no requirement or mandate that these harassment cases are reported. So you said that the VA has accepted that and is going to start collecting that data in 2021. I can't remember what month you said that they would comply in 2021. But to me, this just seems like something that the VA could turn on tomorrow. I don't know what it requires other than saying you will report these cases. So, is it more complicated than that? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. VA has a process or several processes, I should point out. They have their EEO process, they have the harassment prevention process, and then they have sexual harassment complaints that come into managers. It's that last bucket there that we're talking about in our report. There's no requirement. They don't have a centralized information system that where they report, and not only where they report, where they can even see if actions were taken to corrective actions that were taken to address the sexual harassment. What they responded to us is that they are developing a case management system and they're requiring all of their managers to report these actions, but that will not be in place from what they told us until September of next year, 2021.
So, I mean, but is it, to me, it just doesn't seem complicated. It just sort of, to me, it says, tomorrow we will direct managers to collect this data. Is it, is that possible for them to do?
Yes, that is possible for them to do. They do it in a number of different ways, and because they don't have a centralized, way to report it and to track it, they just, don't know, fully what's reported throughout the agency.
Okay.
I could give you some additional examples. Like VHA has a spreadsheet that they use. VBA has, some different procedural changes that they use. So it's kind of disjointed throughout. So they really need that centralized tracking system.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Elam, I wanted to ask you, the VA folks are saying, that VSOs were part of the process of their development of their harassment prevention strategies. Can you confirm that that's the case and that you were involved and other DAVs were involved and had opportunities to make suggestions?
Well, I think that, well, we've had some opportunities to let VA know that there are issues, where we can all work together and partner. But what we'd like to see more, we're not really having seen VA reach out at our service organization level at each of the facilities. We all have departments and chapters that are willing to work with VA at those facilities to try and make those changes. And I think that's really the missing link right now. VA does say on their declaration that they should partner with VSOs to stop harassment, but what does that, where we want to see, specifics on that. There needs to be, bringing folks together to really talk about this issue, whether that be a town hall meeting, bringing folks in to do focus groups within their facility, to really determine where are the problem spots within the facility, what have they seen, and to help come up with good solutions.
Okay, thank you. And the other, I'm pretty sure it was in your report. It might have been in another another testimony, I should say, not report, but that 25% of women report harassment at VA facilities, but at non-VA facilities, the number falls to a stark 5%. So, to me, that's another glaring statistic. I'm frustrated by the fact that everybody has different data. They don't seem to jive. They don't, you don't see trends in the data the way I think that you would like to, at least in my opinion. But I've run out of time, but I am very interested in understanding what, from your vantage point, what the cultural forces are within the VA that fosters this kind of prevalence within an organization. So I think we'll just have to pursue that at a later point. But I thank you for your testimony and your presence here today, and I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd now recognize Mr. Boss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Barnes, in the last panel, and I'm sure you heard when I asked why it was going to take until 2024 to implement the GAO's second recommendation dealing with the EEO program manager realignment at VHA. Do you think that it really has to take till 2024 to fulfill this request, or do you think it can be done quicker?
Yeah, we asked the same question, and we certainly share your concern in terms about, the length of time that it's taking. In terms of whether it could be done quickly, VA says it's a resource issue, but I do think they can align those remaining as 133 program managers and start working through that much quicker.
Okay, I just feel that it should be done a lot quicker in an issue that's as important as this. Ms. Elam, in your testimony, you wrote a few suggestions that women veterans made to improve the VA. The VA has mentioned that they are taking positive steps to make women veterans feel welcome at VA, which has included some of those suggestions. Has DAV heard from any of its members about any sexual harassment that has happened at VBA facilities?
It paused.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Okay, the question, has DVA heard from any of its members about any sexual harassment that has happened at the VBA facilities since we've been working on this?
Harassment at the VBA
At
Veterans Benefits Facility?
Yes.
I have not heard of, reports within VBA.
How about VA?
Are you talking about overall?
Just overall, yes. Since we've been going through this process, has your group been continuing to hear these concerns and of new cases?
Yes, we have continued, these have been continued complaints that we hear from veterans when we have our seminars, when we talk, occasionally we get women veterans that call in to talk about the issue, something that's happened. So these have been ongoing for, some time.
Is it more patient on patient?
Those are generally the reports that we get from women veterans, that there's certain congregations of veterans at certain facilities where, it might be the atrium, it might be outside, it might be in in the lunchroom or waiting area where they say they experience these. And that's why we've really called on leadership in those facilities to look and have people go out and sit and observe to see what's happening.
And this is kind of a rough question to ask, but I'm going to go down this path because do you find that when it is patient on patient, it is an older generation that is stepping down this path?
I don't know necessarily that it's just an older generation. I think it happens in a variety of places with younger veterans as well. From what we've heard from women and talking with them.
Okay. Well, thank you both, and I've got a little bit of time left, but I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boss. With that, I'd recognize Mr. Cisneros for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In VA's testimony, they state that VA continues to emphasize that customer service is one of the VA's overreaching priorities. However, VSOs have consistently raised the concern of clerks and greeters asking women veterans if they are there for their husband's appointment, contributing to the culture of women veterans feeling underserved and less than. Ms. Eeo, will you speak to the issue? Are you hearing from your veterans on issues around the culture of customer service at the VA? Do you agree with the VA statement?
To be fair to VA, I think they've done a lot to improve customer service overall in general from what we've seen. But this is, again, a persistent problem we hear from women veterans when their name is called out, being called Mr., or when they approach someone for assistance and they're asked, are you asking for your husband? So just not having that recognition, they feel, assuming that you're a veteran, and that makes them feel that, they're not understood in a place where, it's a system supposed to be made for them, for veterans, and they, continue to express that.
So is it customer service training that we need to continue to work on in order to change that?
I think making sure that customer service at all levels, from that front greeter to, the volunteer that's helping someone will help, but also just making sure that the training and really providing some information about the role of women in the military today and their service and highlighting what they do. And so that there's a better understanding, I think in general will help VA employees at all levels to understand and recognize women veterans.
All right, thank you. Ms. Barnes, GAO found that the VA's mandatory employee training programs do not adequately inform employees about how to identify and address sexual harassment. In previous administrations, AFGE worked in labor management partnerships to design training on this issue and other issues as well. Will you speak to the value of labor management partnerships, the value that it would bring to the VA if they engage AFGE and other VA unions to work on this training?
Yeah, sure. The value that it would bring to the VA is hopefully they could identify where there were continued gaps. They could find out what employees needed, what supervisors needed, and fill in those any gaps or any voids in those training. One of the things that we talked about in our report about training is VA has this overarching training, but it was providing some details, providing specific modules that really got into some details of, how to recognize and how to report sexual harassment. It's one of the things we focus on, as well as more on their harassment prevention program, which was lacking in a lot of their overarching training materials.
So, Ms. Barnes, also in the GAO report, there was mention the need for bystander intervention to teach employees how to recognize potential problematic behaviors and how to empower them to take action as listed in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission report. Ms. Barnes, will you elaborate on the importance of bystander intervention?
Yes, because one thing that the Merit System Protection Board study, we cite the 22% of those that had experienced sexual harassment, but there was also a number of 33% of those who had observed sexual harassment. So what the bystander training would do would help for those who are observing this behavior, recognize the implications there, report it to the appropriate officials so that it could be addressed appropriately.
Has there been other departments within the government where this training has been held and it's worked and you've seen results?
Our review focused on the VA, so it's I can't speak to the other departments in the government and how their training has been successful.
But it's a proven training, right? It has. I mean, you wouldn't recommend this unless you've seen results or there's been published results that this bystander intervention has worked.
It's certainly a necessary training to help, with reporting and addressing sexual harassment.
All right. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Ms. Custer for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to stick with you this afternoon. I wanted to ask a question of you, Ms. Barnes. I said earlier the frustration I feel that after 8 years in Congress, we're still having this conversation about the VA, and I can't help but feel that this is partly due to the leadership at the top of this country not having the respect for members of the military, but most importantly for women serving our country. And this type of implicit bias that runs throughout, you say persistent, pervasive throughout the VA is in some ways just exhausting. These people have served our country, they put their lives on the line, and the least we could do, as General Bergman said, is to treat them with respect. So I want to thank you, Ms. Barnes, and your colleagues for incredible diligence and thoroughness in this report. And as we look at your recommendations and VA's plans to address them, I'm curious if there are issues that we have not discussed that concern you the most at this point in this hearing.
Well, we certainly have addressed a lot of the issues. I think some of the timing aspects that we've been talking about, certainly with respect to issuing finalized policies for their harassment prevention program. I think also making sure that their overarching policies are consistent throughout with all of their administrations. Things like that should be done pretty quickly. I know we've been talking about the timing of it, so that is something that we also are looking at. I think some of their longer term plans, one in particular, and I know I was just asked this question a few minutes ago in terms of the EEO program manager alignments. I think what's key there is they've done it with one of their administrations. One is in process, VPA is in process, but VHA, they had told us that they didn't see whether it was necessary to do, and they were going to wait fully until the other ones are done. So I think that was key to point out in terms of timing and why things are taking so long. If you don't agree that it needs to be done, you're not going to start implementing it. So I just wanted to kind of point out a few of those and to emphasize it.
Well, that sounds like dragging their feet, or they don't understand the extent of the problem, or they themselves have difficulty with respecting the role of women in our military and the respect that our women veterans deserve. Ms. Elam, thanks so much for your testimony as well. It's an important reminder that the task before the VA is to protect the patients and workforce alike from sexual violence and harassment. Could you comment on cases in which veterans end up going to work for the VA? I'm concerned that situations can arise where veterans who have experienced harassment and violence during their service careers can be re-traumatized by harassment they encounter in their VA workplace.
Very good points. I think in some of the research that VA has done, they've outlined that issue of re-traumatization. So whether they're an employee or, again, just a patient going to care that they desperately need, maybe for PTSD related to sexual assault, the issue of, again, experiencing that harassment, is so detrimental. And so that is a piece that, as you said, it's so frustrating that we're still dealing with this issue and the impact on the people that, what an effect this has, because I think people don't realize how that impacts them when they may go home. Someone might experience that harassment, they turn around, go back to their car, call in and say, I can't make my appointment. No one knows what happened to them. And then what are the situations that, are created for them as they've been re-traumatized for something like that happening.
Well, I can certainly say here in New Hampshire from the meetings that I've had with women veterans, and by the way, this type of harassment can happen to male veterans as well. We know that. We know the sexual assault in the military impacts men. But the women that I've spoken to here in New Hampshire have talked about how they simply do not seek care because our women's health clinic was on the 6th floor, and they it was abusive, honestly, for them to step onto an elevator. They would be assaulted in the elevator. And so we were working with the administrators at the hospital to move the clinic to the 1st floor and have a separate entrance. And we had done that in White River Junction at the hospital there, and it's been highly successful. They literally needed a separate entrance so that they weren't in a waiting room, mixed gender, where they suffered from harassment. They weren't assaulted on the elevator. They weren't harassed throughout the visit, but they could come in, separate entrance, separate staff, be treated with respect. And I think that's a model that I would recommend for the VA. So again, Mr. Chair, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I missed the VA committee, but as chair of the bipartisan task force to end sexual violence, this is discouraging. And I really thank you for putting your shoulder to the wheel. To my good friend, Julia Brownlee, for her role chairing the Women's Task Force, and to all of you in the second panel for the work that you do. Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. I just have one quick question for Ms. Elam, if you're still with us. In your testimony, you described some particular challenges for LGBTQ veterans, and you noted a 2013 study by VA identifying barriers to care for LGBTQ veterans that included concern about the overall culture of VHA. I'm wondering if you could comment further on how this impacts VA's ability to address sexual harassment.
I think it just shows another subpopulation of veterans who have made complaints about experiencing gender harassment at VA. And I think the important piece is, it has to be acknowledged, like the Experience Office that Deputy Secretary spoke about, the Veterans Experience Office. They've done something related to women veterans. I think they need to also do that for other minority veterans, to really look at what is their experience, what is their typical experience when they go to VA, and what is beneficial to them in terms of, what do they value most in terms of going to get their care from VA, but at the same time, what that experience is actually like for them, so that they can address any issues listening to veterans and doing focus groups, that was a new thing that we saw and appreciated that VA did.
Well, thank you for that. Ms. Brownlee, did you have an additional question?
Just one quick one for Ms. Barnes. And we've heard from women employees at the VA that they've been discouraged from reporting harassment by male patients because of a reverence for male veteran service. I'm wondering if you heard from employees, regarding this issue while you talked to employees and in conducting your study. Can you comment on that?
We did not specifically hear about that in our study because of our focus on employees.
And so, but you interviewed employees, right?
Yes.
And did you
Yes.
Interview more women than men employees? Or just it was just a random sampling?
It was a random sampling, and it was mostly those that were in charge of administering the program.
Mostly in charge of administering the program. So just not employees working at the VA who might be victims of sexual harassment.
Right, that's correct.
Okay. I yield back. Thank you.
Anything further from any committee members? General Bergman, do you have any closing comments? Well, with that, I just want to thank our witnesses again for their testimony today, their knowledge. Personal experiences and perspectives are absolutely critical to this conversation moving forward. And without a doubt, both sides of the aisle feel strongly that addressing sexual harassment at VA must be a high priority. I look forward to closely working with Ranking Member Bergman, Chairman Takano, Task Force Chair Brownlee, and all the members on both sides of the aisle of our House Veterans Affairs Committee and others as we continue to conduct oversight, monitor developments, and press for improvements. Congress clearly has a role to play, and Chairwoman Brownlee and Ranking Member Bergman, I plan to introduce legislation that will require VA to implement GAO's recommendations in a timelier fashion, and I hope we can work together on this and other important issues pertaining to sexual harassment. So with that, all members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous materials. The hearing is now adjourned.